Welcome to a deep dive, into Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, Creative Living Beyond Fear. If you're listening to this, I imagine you're probably looking to, tap into your creative potential, and this book is kind of like a toolbox for just that. We'll be uncovering some pretty fascinating stories and ideas today, things like a poet who chose a mountaintop over fame, and even the idea that anxieties can be like an unwelcome road trip, you know?
Gilbert has this really interesting way of blending, personal stories with like a framework that feels almost mystical, but somehow also
Yeah,
practical.
right. It's not just, airy-fairy inspiration. She gives you
Oh.
concrete things to try. So let's start with this idea of courage. Gilbert talks about this poet, Jack Gilbert, no relation, of course, who basically won the poetry lottery but chose to live in a shepherd's hut in Greece for like 20 years.
Hmm.
He thought fame was boring. What do you make of that, especially for someone just starting out, on their creative journey?
It's easy to think we need permission or recognition from others to validate our creative work. But Jack Gilbert's story really challenges that.
Yeah.
He chose to prioritize his connection with his art over external validation, which takes a certain level of, stubbornness. Have you ever felt pulled between what you truly want to create and what you think might bring you success?
Yeah, definitely. It's like he was saying, I'm going to be so good at this and enjoy it so much that fame would just be a distraction. And he encouraged his students to approach their creative lives with this sense of stubborn gladness. Have you ever felt that kind of pure joy in creating where nothing else really mattered?
That joy can be a powerful fuel, especially when you're facing fear, which Gilbert acknowledges is a constant companion for creatives.
Mhm.
She describes herself as a frightened person, but highlights the difference between the fear we need to keep us safe
Mm.
and the unnecessary fear that holds us back.
So, like, fear of a bear chasing you is useful, but fear of, your watercolor painting not being good is maybe not so much. But how do we quiet those anxieties when we actually sit down to create?
Gilbert doesn't suggest eliminating fear entirely. She offers this striking image. She sees fear and creativity as conjoined twins. They're inseparable, both part of the creative process.
Instead of fighting them, you just acknowledge that they're along for the ride, but they don't get to drive. That's a good shift in perspective. But even with the courage to create, sometimes the ideas just aren't there. Gilbert talks about ideas almost like these entities floating around looking for human collaborators. Have you ever felt like an idea just found you?
It's definitely a bit of magical thinking, but it can be a useful framework. Gilbert suggests that ideas are all around us trying to get our attention. She uses this great example of a highway being built through the Amazon rainforest when the workers returned after the rainy season.
The jungle had completely swallowed it. Like bulldozers, tires, everything just gone.
Exactly. And Gilbert suggests that if we're not receptive, maybe we're distracted or stressed or just not paying attention, those ideas will move on to someone else who is ready.
It's a powerful image of how an idea can just appear out of nowhere, fully formed, and almost overtake you. What sparks your curiosity these days? What whispers of ideas are you noticing?
It's a great question to ponder.
Yeah.
But then there's also this idea that to be truly creative, you have to suffer for your art.
Yeah.
Gilbert seems to push back against that.
Yeah.
She talks about different contracts you can have with creativity.
Right. There's that suffering artist trope that great art can only come from pain.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But Gilbert proposes this more joyful, collaborative approach built on curiosity and a willingness to play. Which contract do you think you've been operating under so far?
I think I've leaned more towards the suffering artist's side, which is definitely not sustainable. Gilbert also talks about how you don't need anyone's permission to be creative. Her own parents were these quietly rebellious figures who just did their own thing.
Yeah, her dad was a chemical engineer, but in his spare time, he became a Christmas tree farmer and a goat herder. He even put this note in a Navy suggestion box that just read, "I suggest you remove this suggestion box."
Wow. And her mom was a master of DIY projects, always tinkering and creating. It's like they instilled this sense of, I'm going to do it anyway, in her from a young age.
That self-reliance is what Gilbert believes allowed her to pursue writing so fiercely.
But it's not just about permission, right? She also talks about feeling entitled to a creative life.
It's not arrogance, but more of a sense of deserving to express yourself, pushing back against that voice that says, "Who are you to do this?"
We all have that voice, don't we?
We do. But Gilbert argues that creating isn't about ego. It's about giving voice to something authentic. It makes me think about her story about Eileen, who gets tattoos just on a whim.
And she says that it's not permanent ink on a temporary body, it's permanent ink on a temporary body. Such a powerful way to think about embracing a vibrant creative life while you have the chance.
It's about seizing the moment and realizing that this creative energy you have deserves to be expressed.
It's really inspiring. So we've talked about courage, embracing ideas, and giving ourselves permission, but what about those inevitable roadblocks? The creative process isn't always smooth sailing, is it?
That's where persistence comes in. Gilbert's story about her short story, Elk Talk, is a great example. It got rejected by this top literary magazine, even with a personalized note from the editor.
Ouch, that's got to sting, even with the kind words. What did she do?
She just kept sending it out. And years later, that same magazine with the same editor accepted it. The editor even praised the ending, which she had criticized in the rejection letter.
Wow, what a plot twist. What do you think that story tells us about navigating rejection in our own creative journeys?
It highlights the unpredictable nature of the creative process. What might be rejected today could be celebrated tomorrow. And it speaks to the importance of persistence. Even rejections can plant seeds that might bloom later on. Gilbert believes that if you're truly drawn to an idea, it's worth fighting for, even if it takes years to find its audience.
So we need to keep showing up, keep honing our craft, even when it feels like we're getting nowhere. But how do we deal with that, nagging feeling of self-doubt, that feeling of being a fraud? I think so many people struggle with that, myself included.
It's incredibly common, especially when you're pushing yourself creatively.
Yeah.
Gilbert actually normalizes those feelings.
Mm.
She even admits to having scrapped an entire book because it just wasn't working.
Yeah.
She calls these challenging parts the shit sandwich, or the creative process.
I love that phrase. So relatable. But if we know that shit sandwich is coming, how do we mentally prepare for it?
It's about accepting it as part of the process, not a sign of failure. You're not alone in feeling this way. Even seasoned creators go through it. Gilbert emphasizes that the act of creation itself is valuable, even if the outcome isn't what we hoped for. How do you typically handle those moments when self-doubt creeps in? What strategies have you found helpful?
Honestly, I tend to just avoid the work altogether, which I know isn't helpful. Gilbert has this interesting idea about not putting too much pressure on your creativity to be a source of income or validation.
Right. She argues that if you burden your creativity with those expectations, it can stifle the flow of inspiration. Instead, she suggests finding ways to support your creative work without demanding that it pay all the bills. She even compares it to having an affair.
An affair? Okay, now I'm intrigued. How does that relate to creativity?
Well, think about it. You steal moments here and there. You prioritize that connection, even when it feels like you have no time. She suggests approaching your creativity as if you were going on a date. Dress up, put on your, metaphorical best, and show up fully present, even if it's just for 15 minutes.
So it's about making that time sacred, creating a ritual around it, almost like a secret rendezvous with your muse.
Exactly. It's about rekindling that spark and making it a priority, even if it means, sneaking around a bit.
That's such a great shift in perspective. It's not about waiting for huge chunks of time. It's about finding those pockets of inspiration and treating them with reverence.
Speaking of inspiration, Gilbert has some interesting thoughts on that whole follow your passion mantra.
Yeah, she's not a huge fan of that, is she?
She argues that not everyone has this, singular burning passion. And for those who do, passions can evolve and change over time. So what's the alternative?
She believes that curiosity is a more accessible and sustainable path to creative fulfillment. Instead of waiting for this grand passion to sweep us off our feet, we can cultivate a sense of wonder and follow those threads of interest wherever they may lead.
It's about noticing what sparks your curiosity, even if it seems small or insignificant at first. Those little sparks can ignite into much bigger creative fires. Do you have any examples from your own life where curiosity led you down an unexpected creative path?
Let me think. I was just thinking about what you said before about curiosity, leading to these unexpected creative paths. I had this experience a few years ago. I was feeling super burnt out with work, and I just kind of stumbled upon this beginner's pottery class. I never really thought of myself as like an artsy person, but I was curious.
That's so cool. What happened?
Well, I totally fell in love with it. The feel of the clay, the challenge of, centering the wheel, even the messy cleanup. It all just spoke to me. It was this amazing creative outlet, a way to de-stress and reconnect with myself. I'm still not like a master potter or anything, but the experience really opened my eyes to the power of just embracing curiosity and trying new things.
That's such a perfect example of what Gilbert's talking about, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we limit ourselves by thinking we need this grand passion or clearly defined path. But so often it's the little unexpected detours that lead to the most fulfilling discoveries.
It's like she's saying, don't overthink it. Just follow what piques your interest and see where it takes you.
Exactly. And she tells this story about how her own curiosity about the plants in her garden led to her writing the signature of all things.
Oh, right. She started researching like the origins of those plants and ended up deep diving into the history of botanical exploration. It's amazing how something as simple as a backyard garden can spark such a grand creative journey.
It really speaks to the interconnectedness of everything, right? One tiny spark of interest can lead to a whole universe of discovery. Speaking of interconnectedness, Gilbert also talks about how our creative work is often a reflection of our personal experiences,
Yeah.
both the good and the bad.
Yes. And she's very open about her own struggles with rejection and self-doubt, even fear of success. It can be so intimidating to put yourself out there creatively, knowing that not everyone will, understand or appreciate your work.
Yeah,
Have you ever dealt with that fear of judgment in your own creative endeavors? I mean,
absolutely. It's something that I
like,
think every creator faces at some point. Gilbert talks about this time when she threw away a whole finished book because it just wasn't working.
mhm.
Imagine the courage it takes to let go of something you've poured so much time and energy into.
It's a powerful reminder that even when we think something is finished, it might just be the starting point for something even better. She also has some pretty blunt advice for dealing with
Oh,
critics.
yeah. She basically tells them to, put politely as possible to go make their own damn art.
I love that. It's so liberating. It reminds us that we have to create for ourselves first and foremost. But even with that self-focus, it's easy to fall into the trap of letting our creative pursuits consume our lives. Gilbert cautions against that, right?
She definitely warns against becoming so obsessed with our work that we neglect other important parts of our lives, our relationships, our health, our well-being. She tells this really heartbreaking story about a friend whose grief over his wife's death totally consumed him.
And it was his daughters who asked him to paint their bicycles that helped him reconnect with his creative spark.
And he ended up covering those bikes with these intricate constellations of stars, transforming them into something really magical.
Right.
What I find so moving about that story is how it shows that even in the midst of deep pain, creativity can be this source of healing and connection.
It's a reminder that creativity doesn't have to be this grand, all-consuming endeavor. Sometimes the smallest acts of creation can be the most powerful. Gilbert also challenges the idea that creativity has to be this solo pursuit.
Right? She's a big advocate for collaboration and the unexpected magic that can happen when you bring different perspectives and ideas together. Think about those Balinese priests who started performing their sacred dances for tourists.
Oh, right. And some Westerners were like scandalized by this, this blending of the sacred and the profane. So the priests created these fake dances for the tourists, incorporating moves from the sacred dances, but without the spiritual significance.
It was pretty clever, actually, a way to satisfy both audiences. But then something really interesting happened. The tourists started mimicking those fake dances, and eventually those dances made their way back into the temples and were incorporated into the sacred ceremonies.
So the lines blurred completely. That challenges our whole notion of what's authentic or original, doesn't it?
It really does. It highlights this fluid nature of creativity, how ideas can evolve and transform through collaboration and these unexpected influences. Gilbert seems to be suggesting that maybe we shouldn't be so precious about our ideas.
Like, let go of the need to control everything. Embrace the unexpected and see what emerges.
Exactly. And speaking of unexpected influences, she mentions how the musician Tom Waits had this epiphany about his songwriting process after watching his kids create.
He said, I realize that as a songwriter, the only thing I really do is make jewelry for the inside of other people's minds.
What a beautiful way to reframe the creative process.
Yeah.
It's not about saving the world or achieving some grand level of fame. It's about creating something beautiful and meaningful that resonates with others.
It really takes the pressure off, allowing for more playfulness and experimentation.
That reminds me of another story Gilbert shares about this guy who showed up at a medieval-themed costume party dressed as a lobster.
Oh, yeah. Poor guy. But he totally owned it, didn't he?
He did. Instead of shrinking away, in shame, he just embraced the absurdity of it all. And the other guests loved him for it.
It's like a perfect illustration of Gilbert's trickster versus martyr concept, right? The martyr would have been mortified and probably gone home early, but the trickster turned it into this, memorable moment.
Exactly. The trickster is playful, adaptable, and doesn't take themselves too seriously. They're not afraid to bend the rules or try something unconventional. The martyr, on the other hand, believes in suffering for their art, often getting bogged down in self-doubt and perfectionism.
I think we've all been the martyr at some point in our creative journeys, but Gilbert seems to suggest that embracing that trickster energy can make the whole process a lot more enjoyable and ultimately more productive.
It's about finding that sweet spot between discipline and lightness. Showing up for the work but not being afraid to experiment and even laugh at your mistakes. So as you reflect on this trickster concept, what resonates with you? How might you invite more playfulness and adaptability into your own creative process?
Well, for me, it's about letting go of the need for everything to be perfect, giving myself permission to experiment, to make mistakes, to not take it all so seriously. I love that idea of approaching my creative work with a sense of humor and adventure.
I love that. And it speaks to Gilbert's belief that creativity is often about embracing the unexpected and finding the humor in the midst of chaos. She reminds us that even those messy, uncertain parts can be incredibly rewarding if we approach them with an open mind and a playful heart.
Absolutely. Speaking of uncertainty, we haven't really touched on the spiritual dimension of creativity that Gilbert explores.
Right. She doesn't advocate for any specific religion, but she does talk about this connection to something bigger than ourselves, what she calls the divinity of creativity.
And she mentions how ancient cultures believed in, muses and demons, these external forces that inspired artists. She even talks about this Roman concept of genius as being something you have rather than something you are.
It's like they saw creativity as this gift from the universe,
Ooh.
something that flowed through them rather than originating solely from within.
So it's not all on us to come up with these brilliant ideas. We can tap into this universal well of inspiration. But how do we actually access that well? What are some practical ways to cultivate that sense of connection, to something bigger than ourselves in our creative work?
Gilbert emphasizes the importance of gratitude, being thankful for the opportunity to create even when it's challenging. She also talks about cultivating a sense of awe and wonder, noticing those moments of magic when an idea clicks or you have a creative breakthrough.
Like becoming more mindful of the creative process, to really savor those moments of inspiration and connection.
Exactly. And to trust that the universe will meet us halfway.
Just like that highway in the Amazon that got reclaimed by the jungle, it's a powerful reminder that creativity can be this force of nature.
And sometimes it means surrendering control and allowing ourselves to be swept away by the current.
It's both awe-inspiring and a little bit terrifying at the same time.
That's the beauty of big magic. It invites us to embrace that paradoxical nature of creativity, to hold space for both the light and the shadow, the joy and the struggle.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into big magic, what's the final message you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's this. You have permission to create, to explore, to play, and to trust the, mysterious, magical unfolding of your own creative journey.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
And you never know, you might even inspire a few idea entities to come knocking at your door.
Just be sure to answer when they do. Who knows what kind of magic might be waiting on the other side.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What's resonating with you most from Gilbert's big magic? What insights are you taking away from this exploration?
For me, it's this idea that creativity isn't, just about talent or skill. It's about showing up and doing the work even when it's, scary or hard.
It's embracing the whole process,
Mm-hmm.
the messy parts, the unpredictable parts, and trusting that something good will come out of it, even if it's not what you expected. Gilbert talks about that sense of divinity in creativity, like tapping into something bigger than ourselves. It's not about religion, but more of like a feeling of awe and wonder about where those creative impulses come from.
Right. Remember she talks about ancient cultures and how they believed in muses and demons, those external forces that inspired artists and, guided their work. It's like they knew creativity wasn't always a conscious effort.
It's almost like they thought inspiration could just strike, like a bolt of lightning from the sky.
And even though we don't use those same terms today, I think that sense of mystery and wonder is still there.
And it makes me think about that feeling you get when you're working on something and suddenly you have a breakthrough. That aha moment when everything just clicks. It feels like a gift from somewhere else.
Gilbert encourages us to pay attention to those moments.
Yeah.
To be grateful for the chance to create, even when it's hard.
She also talks about not taking ourselves too seriously, to approach our work with a sense of playfulness and humor.
Like that story about the guy who showed up at the costume party dressed as a lobster. He could have been so embarrassed, but he just went with it.
And he ended up being the life of the party. It's a great reminder that sometimes our biggest creative breakthroughs happen when we let go of that need for everything to be perfect and, just let ourselves have fun.
It's that trickster energy, being willing to experiment, to mess up and even laugh at ourselves.
That reminds me of what you were saying before about not putting too much pressure on our creativity to make money or get validation.
Right. It's about creating because it brings you joy. Allowing ourselves to explore and experiment without all that expectation weighing us down.
And Gilbert suggests finding ways to support that creative work without needing it to pay the bills. She uses that interesting analogy of having an affair with your creativity.
It's about those stolen moments, those secret rendezvous with your muse.
It's so true. Sometimes those moments are all you need to keep that creative spark going.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into big magic, what's the one thing you'd want our listener to take away as they, go on their own creative journey?
I think it's remembering that you are a creative being. It's in your nature. Trust that creativity, cultivate your curiosity, and just give yourself permission to explore, experiment, and play. You never know what you might discover.
That's beautiful. And remember, just like that highway in the Amazon that got taken aback by the jungle, creativity is a force of nature. Embrace that wildness, surrender to the flow, and trust that something amazing will come out of it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into big magic. Until next time, keep those creative sparks alive.